All right, that's our first PvP kill. Okay. Don't run from the guy with a musket. Come on. Curious Cop here, and let's talk about how you can come up with your own unique character builds in New World. Okay, first things first, you've got to figure out your own playstyle. Now, New World is a classless system. That means that all the progression is based on the weapons that you wield. So you need to figure out what kind of weapons you prefer. Perhaps you prefer to get up close and personal, like with the spear and the warhammer. Or maybe you prefer to stay at a distance and snipe your enemies down with fierce magic, or even bows and arrows and muskets. Whatever you choose, it's important to make sure that it fits how you're going to enjoy playing the game. So take some time, try out all the different weapons, because eventually you're going to want to spend a lot of time mastering these different weapon systems as you progress through the skill trees. So it has to be something that you enjoy playing. Playstyle is more than just whether or not you enjoy the weapons. It's also about how you're actually going to play the game. So are you going to play solo like this? You're going to need to have a little bit of crowd control. Are you going to need to consider how you're going to do your own healing, because you're not going to have anyone helping you out? And that's going to be really important when choosing your weapons, just so that you can get a little bit of all of those skills in there. Or is this going to be more of a familiar sight for you, going into expeditions with a group where everyone has a specialist role, whether it's healer, tank, DPS, and that means that when you pick your weapon, you're going to have to really focus on min-maxing and specializing your build out to help the rest of the team.
Yeah, I think maybe like an AoE.
Now, there are so many weapons and so many different ways to approach New World that I just strongly encourage you to go out there and try as many as you can, find out what works for you, and ideally whittle down the weapon choices to about 3 or 4, because this will just give you a little bit of focus when you start looking at the attribute menu. Now, as you level, you'll gain additional attribute points that you can start putting into these different categories, which are strength, dexterity, intelligence, focus, and constitution. And as you can see, next to each of these, there's a list of which weapons scale with those points. That is to say, when you put points into strength, your power with a sword and shield will increase, as will great axe, warhammer, hatchet, and spear. You can see some of these weapons actually have 2 attribute lines that they scale with, and some of them just have the 1. And that's really cool because it allows you to look for kind of synergies across the different attributes too, if you particularly like to. Indeed, you can see here that I've piled all of my points into dexterity, and that's very specifically for the build that I'm looking at, and we'll use that as an example. But you don't have to just pile them all into one. You can spread them across different ones as well. I'll just really quickly run through these attributes just so that you know the value of them and what they bring to the build. You'll notice that there's steps along each of the attribute progression lines that cut off at 50 and at 100 and at 150, etc. And at each of those levels, you get additional bonuses by having that many points in that particular skill. You'll also notice that these are contributed from not just points committed by us as players, but also items that are equipped and buffs that are equipped. So that's something to bear in mind too. I've only actually put 35 points into Constitution, but the added Constitution from the gears that I'm wearing has bumped me over the 50-point mark. Now, straight away, I'm going to call out the gathering increase. You'll see here a plus 10% to logging speed. That's awesome, but we address gathering in a different video, so I won't dive into that just here right now. We'll focus on the stats that will actually help us with our playstyle. And in the case of Constitution, all health consumables 20% stronger. That's generally quite a useful one, and I really raced out on Constitution to get that in the early stages of leveling because I felt that would be quite useful. Will I keep it long term? Probably not. I'll probably respec that out because I don't really need that as a damage build. But if you were a tank and you were taking a lot of potions, that would be a really good place to go. The next level up increases your max health by 10% of your physical armor. That's awesome. And now we're really starting to get heavily into, okay, this is helpful for a tank and not really anyone else. If you're not taking damage, this is going to be next to useless. Next up, we reduce the damage we take from crits. That's huge. And onwards and onwards. You can see that Constitution is very much geared towards tanks. If that's the build that you're looking for, great. If not, don't worry about it. Next up, focus. You'll notice that there's only one weapon that actually scales with focus, and that's the life staff. And that is a common theme with this one too. You'll see the bonuses very much geared towards healers. Mana regen rate could be useful for other spellcasters, but when you start progressing along this mana pool, okay, maybe it's useful for spellcasters, and now you're up to 20% healing output. Okay, no, it's entirely healers, and onwards and onwards. Now, It's really interesting that you could see some intelligence builds pick up these mini ones, but actually there's stronger ones in the intelligence tree which probably limit it. So really, when you look at focus, it's only useful if you're going to do healing. Next up on intelligence, you can see with intelligence, these are all of the magic-based damage dealers, so Ice Gauntlet and Fire Staff, plus a little bit of Rapier and a little bit of Musket. Now, that's a bit of an odd one for me. I would have thought that perhaps it would be more on the focus side. That would have been great as well, because it would have been fantastic for a healer build, but never mind. And on the intelligence build, you can see that the buffs straight away are focusing on magic attacks, right? So 10% damage to light and heavy magic attacks. Then we're into critical hit damage. That could be useful for other weapons, but it's kind of next to useless considering you have to get through the magic attacks. Then we're elemental damage, and then we're on mana regen, and now we're into mana efficiencies, actually. Now, I've kind of dismissed this as sort of saying like this is entirely magic casters, but of course, the really important thing to note in this is that there are gems in the game that can actually turn some of your physical damage into magic damage. So actually, this isn't a huge loss to pile points into this and then also have a physical attack as well, provided you can gem and get the benefit of these buffs. But in general, again, intelligence is pretty geared towards magic users, and it would be a hybrid build that would take advantage of it if you were to go down that route. Next up, dexterity. This one, as you can see, the buffs are really focused on critical hit chance. A little bit of a difference here where they focus on thrust damage, and that's really interesting for this particular build. We'll come back to that in a second. And then next up, we have dodges that cost less stamina, bonus to backstab and headshot damage, bonus to critical hit damage. So this is definitely a build that you can start to see focuses on range and avoiding damage, and then trying to get big hits back with critical hits or headshots. And you can see here quite a lot of weapons have a bit of dexterity in them, you know, weapons with a bit more finesse and also ranged weapons. So that's really cool because there's quite a lot of weapons here that can actually key off dexterity, and that's kind of why I went for a real min-max on this, because I think there's enough coverage there to have variety in the weapons that you choose to. And then finally, strength. Strength is a real jack of all trades one, because you have damage to melee weapons at all. If you're thinking of going melee at all, then strength is the right way to go, because you just get flat damage increases to all of your weapon light attacks, heavy attacks, and then indeed you start to cause stamina damage from your melee weapons as well. So this is just a great all-round melee build. If you're thinking of melee and you're not sure which way to go, focus on strength. Now, a really good exercise is to take the shortlist weapons that you got from the last thing you did and map them to these attributes and see where they land. So let's say that you really liked musket, rapier, and sword and shield. Now, that's really cool because the commonality between them is dexterity. So there's a cool decision here to sort of say, well, okay, I could go for sword and musket so I can have ranged and melee, and that would allow me to focus on dexterity because I can still get benefit on my sword with some of these dexterities. Not all of them, but with some of them. Another way to look at it would be, well, actually, rapier is a melee weapon, so maybe I can just focus on strength and get the melee weapon light attacks in strength too, because what I really want to do is focus on sword, but I also like rapier for some of its skills too. Once you start to map those to the different attributes, you can start to pick out which attributes you want to focus on, and we'll come back to why that's important in a moment. Before we do that though, really important to say that min-maxing is a thing, and piling all your points into one of the attributes is a potential way to go. But one of the great things about the classless system in New World is that you don't have to min-max, and you can still be an extremely viable character. So, for example, spreading your points across 2 or even 3 of the attribute lines is totally feasible. There are some amazing builds out there that take in some strength, but then also on focus. And for example, go for like a paladin build. So have like a life staff and a warhammer, and they are absolutely incredible and fantastic for PvP. But it really depends on what your play style is and which weapons you really, really like. If you really enjoyed playing with Warhammer and you really enjoyed playing with life staff, then yeah, you should definitely try out the paladin build. It's awesome. But if they just didn't really click for you and they weren't really your weapons, then don't force it. And I think that's the really important thing. This is why I like this approach, because it starts with what you care about and then builds on it. So the reason why we go through all of that to figure out which attribute lines we really like is so that we can start to understand where the synergies are. So for example, let's look through the dexterity tree that I've been using for this build, and you can see that the bonuses that I get are things like critical hit, thrust damage, dodges are favored, backstab, headshot are favored, more critical hit, and even more critical hit. So if I was to pick a weapon or two weapons that really favored dexterity and pile all my points into that, then these bonuses basically act like keywords that I should use to start making decisions with. So for example, I was thinking of going for a musket hatchet build to begin with, just because I really enjoyed playing with hatchet in the early game. But what I realized was that hatchet had slash damage, and this first buff of 5% thrust damage, or the second buff rather, really was lost on the hatchet because there was no thrust damage from the hatchet. So I started to look at other weapons that maybe I liked, but I wasn't choosing, that maybe had thrust damage. And then I thought about spear. So now I've come up with a build which is spear musket, which optimizes for the thrust damage. The other factor is to start to look at these other limits and identify keywords that we can use in our weapon mastery trees. So when you start heading over to the weapon mastery, you can look at a weapon and start to say, well, I know for a fact that critical hit is a big deal when it comes to dexterity. I get a lot of bonuses with critical hits and headshots. So I'll start looking through these weapon trees to identify skills and abilities that will give me better chances of getting headshots and critical hits, or getting bonuses when I get them. Because if I do that, then I'm like doubling and doubling and doubling the effect as I go. So this first one, precise jabs, a plus 5% critical hits chance on light attacks, that adds to the already flat plus 10% critical hit chance that I have from my dexterity tree. I also have here, for example, follow through, so I gain empower on critical hits. So not only am I increasing the chance of my critical hits from these other skills, but when I do critical hit, which is a high chance, I then gain empower, which increases my damage again. So you can start to see how these synergies start to really work together and start to boost each other along. Then when I go back and I look at the musket and I say, okay, so that's great. I can see that the spear definitely works with dexterity, but how does the musket work with dexterity? So on the sharpshooter side, for example, I have here on successful headshot, grant empower, increasing all musket shots damage by 10% for 5 seconds. So this is really cool, right? Because now what I'm saying is in the dexterity tree, I'm piling all those points in and I'm gaining critical hit, and that's buffing my spear. But I'm also gaining a bunch of headshot damage, and the spear's not very good for that, but the musket is. And as you can see, I've now got empower on the headshot on the headshot for musket as well, and I've also got empower on the spear for when I get a critical hit. So it's just empower all over the place. I've also got other headshot benefits. So for example, called shot resupply. I get to reduce my cooldowns when I land headshots, which is great. And indeed, chronic trauma, so powder burn can have its burn extended when I get a headshot too. So these are all really, really great. And indeed, bullseye itself is fantastic because you can actually reduce cooldowns yet again with these two. So if you end up in a ranged battle, then land a bunch of headshots, get a bunch of empower, and then get back around and get those cooldowns running again, which is really cool. So as you can see, by selecting the weapons that you really love to play and then using those choices to align to various different attribute lines, you gain a lexicon and a keyword search that you can then use in your weapon mastery trees to start building cool things out. So you look for additional critical hit, or you look for additional debuffs. This one's really cool. So exploited weakness. I know that all of the attacks that I've got for spear and musket put debuffs on the target, so I know that I can increase my damage by up to 30% by getting exploited weakness, which is what I'm going for with this build. And by doing that, you can start to see really cool synergies that can start to really make the build work for you. And you've built it on the basis that you also just enjoy playing these weapons, which is just a fantastic way to start. Thanks for joining me for another video. I'm really excited to see all your amazing builds. Have fun.